Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cloud Institute. My name is Jeff Fudge. This is the third webinar I'm doing on behalf of the Cloud Institute, so thank you for joining us today. Today, we're talking about the advantages of cloud computing. And I should say that my information isn't coming just from doing Google searches. It's really based on my background, and I've been Director of Infrastructure, CTO, CIO, VP of Technology. I've helped 6 or 7 different companies move to the cloud as an IT leader. And over the last 6 years, I've worked for cloud providers, helping companies migrate to the cloud themselves. So this is based on my experience both as a cloud customer and as a cloud services provider. So first, we're going to kick off with a short introduction. Then I'm going to talk about the cloud computing advantages, really what I have seen in my experiences based on what sometimes what the cloud providers say are advantages, but I've excluded any that I haven't seen in real life that I think are more marketing based than reality based. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some metrics so the audience can see how companies have adopted and how many are doing that and still doing that. I think it's always interesting to talk about future predictions on the subject at hand. So we'll talk about some predictions, both short term and longer term for cloud computing, and then we'll open it up to questions. I thought this cartoon was very applicable. I was the CTO at a mid-sized company, and we had migrated to the cloud, and we had an issue with the server, and the CEO was asking why the website was so slow. We had a big e-commerce website, and I said, "Oh, we had an issue with the server." And he said, "What do you mean, an issue with the server? We're in the cloud." And so that brings me to the next slide, which is just keep in mind that cloud is a fancy marketing term. At the end of the day, whether it's Amazon Web Services, also known as AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google's Compute Cloud, GCP, those are still data centers. It's still storage. It's still servers. Yes, a lot of that's easier, but there's no magic to the cloud. It's not a black box. It's still the same technology. Typically, though, someone else is managing a lot of that low-level effort, and you're just focusing on hopefully what helps you differentiate your business. But again, no magic in this term called cloud. And I think it's just marketing hyperbole, way overused, but we'll also discuss that a little bit further in the presentation. So there are really 3 different types of cloud computing. And the first is private cloud, and I've been in IT quite some time. And this used to be just considered on-prem computing or co-located computing. Private cloud means you're not using AWS, Azure, Oracle's cloud, IBM's cloud. Typically, this is used by one company or maybe multiple subsidiaries of a company. And this is hardware typically that you own, although you could lease it, but hardware you typically own running in your data center, or maybe your company is not large enough to build their own data center, so you use another facility. Sometimes you buy the hardware, sometimes you can lease their hardware. But this is the older school method of doing computing. And even companies that move to the cloud typically don't go away from that entirely. But that is now to adopt to the marketing term cloud. They're calling that private cloud. And typically very virtualized. Maybe you're using VMware, which is now owned by Broadcom. Maybe you're using Hyper-V, the Microsoft's virtualization. But so that's one version of the cloud now called private cloud. And then if you compare and contrast that to what we call public cloud, that's typically available to many companies. So AWS, Azure, GCP have a lot of different customers using that hardware, and typically you share that unless you pay more not to share it. you have no access to the data center, no access to the servers. You're operating at the operating system level or above. So no access to hardware, and that's an advantage we'll talk about in a minute. So you are essentially renting the hardware and the services, and you pay for only what you use. And that's a big difference than private cloud. I've been in many companies where you have a capital budget, a CapEx budget. You have to put in how many servers are you going to buy any given year, how much storage. You try to predict, oh, these servers will be good for 5 to 7 years. In the public cloud, you rent what you need. If you need more, you change that. You start getting billed for more. If you decide to stop being in the cloud, you can stop everything today and you won't be billed tomorrow. No long-term contracts unless you want a savings plan. And then you have some spend commitments. But if you don't want any commitment, you are just committed for the hour you're using it, and you can stop at any time. And again, that's an advantage that we'll talk about a little bit more. And then marketing speak says, well, hybrid cloud is really a combination of using your own servers on-prem or in a co-location facility, also private cloud, and you're using public cloud at the same time. Now they're saying a hybrid cloud. When I talk to customers about the cloud, I don't use the term hybrid cloud very often. I think you will find other professionals don't, but you'll see that sometimes in articles or how-to articles. But it's not very common today, I would say, to see companies only in the public cloud. A lot of companies want some on-prem equipment. This might be because it's mission critical. They don't want to worry about losing internet connectivity, even if it's redundant. They want low latency. Maybe for security reasons, they want to make sure no one else has access to the hardware, etc. The one exception I would say for companies that are entirely in the public cloud are startups today. If you're a startup, you're typically often everyone's remote. You don't want to pay for a data center. You don't want to rent data center equipment. You don't want to pay for that equipment. You're going to go all in the cloud and typically stay there. But those are the three different types of cloud computing that you also see referenced anytime you're reading information about the cloud. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about market share, and I don't think you can read a whole lot in a market share into what's best. In terms of my own personal experience, I've used AWS, have been hands-on with AWS, and have managed teams of AWS cloud engineers. I've also done the same with Azure. I've managed engineers using Google Cloud, but not hands-on with that. AWS got there first, which is predominantly why they have the market share. Microsoft gets a lot of traction with Azure for companies that are using M365 or using the Windows stack for their development environment. And so to me, you really have to just pick a horse and run with it. I've sometimes been asked to compare AWS with Azure. They're very competitive. They remain price competitive. They're very service competitive. I try not to make it a religious argument one way or the other. Like I said, you pick one and you maximize it to the full extent that you can. And it, often just comes down to personal preference. So let's get into the meat of this discussion. Let's talk about some of the advantages. And one of the things you're not going to hear me talk about is it's cheaper. And if you look back when the cloud was first really coming about, that was all the marketing. The cloud is cheaper. The cloud is cheaper. I was doing a presentation once in front of a lot of Florida-based CIOs. There were about 25 of them. And I asked who thought the cloud was cheaper than on-prem. And one CIO raised his hand. The other 24 did not believe it. And I said, how long have you been in the cloud since you think it's cheaper? He said, oh, I'm not there yet. So the reason the cloud isn't cheaper, there's a couple reasons. The primary reason is, they typically say you should replace your servers every 4 years. I've worked for a variety of companies. I talk to a good number of companies every day of the week. People don't refresh their computers, their servers every 4 years. It could be 7, it could be 8, it could be 10, it could be, I'm going to run the server until it dies. Keep in mind that the cloud providers aren't going to put you on old hardware. They need the hardware to be reliable, so they're not always having to repair it. So you're getting state-of-the-art, typically chipsets. Some may be a little bit older, but the hardware hasn't reached end of life like you might find in a lot of environments. So I won't be talking about cost advantages. If you looked at your overall TCO and the fact that you're not hiring network engineers, you're not hiring storage engineers, it can be cheaper from a total TCO perspective, total cost of ownership. But just from an apples to apples, it's rarely cheaper, so I won't be talking about that. One of the big wins to me, based on my own experience, is IT efficiency. And IT departments historically have been viewed as cost centers. Okay, you're a necessary component of this company, but you're a cost center. Your job is to keep the lights on. You provision the hardware, you rack and stack it anytime new ones are built. You have to replace the failed hardware. You've got to make sure that you've got power redundancy. You have to make sure that you've got proper cooling in your data center. Sometimes it's just a server closet, nothing fancy. You have to be concerned about hardware configuration. And so a lot of the time is spent worrying about the hardware, keeping it properly configured, making sure it's resilient, worrying about disaster recovery. What happens if something fails, if a hard drive fails? What's our process? Do we have spare parts? So when you move to the cloud, it's less about keeping the lights on because you're paying a provider such as Amazon or Microsoft or Google to do that for you. What that means is then you can staff up your IT department not to focus on that as much, but focus on what is really going to differentiate your company. What kind of services? Maybe we need to enhance the website. Maybe we need to enhance the applications that our salespeople use or our product people use. So you can see that the cloud allows IT departments to become much more strategic and not just keep things going day to day, keeping the lights on, as I said, but focusing on company differentiation. So product and service development, let's develop new products for the market. What are some of the strategic initiatives? A lot of strategic initiatives are around innovation. What can we do with Gen AI? What can we do with data analytics? So you're basically paying the cloud providers to do what the AWS CTO often says, undifferentiated heavy lifting. So they are doing that heavy lifting. They are keeping the lights on for you so that your IT labor budget, your IT department can become more strategic and less tactical from keeping the lights on. Another advantage is scalability. And I've worked for a number of retailers, and retailers, certainly it's a cyclical business. Christmas, the holidays, certainly a peak. Back to school is another peak. And you've got holidays, often you have peak business. And the challenge when you don't run in the cloud, you have to buy hardware, and you have to buy hardware for the peak. So for a retailer, you typically look at trends and say, okay, my peak is always in December, at least for US-based businesses because of Christmas and the holidays. And so you buy all the hardware to handle the peak. The rest of the time it's sitting there underutilized. But the cloud allows you near real-time extra capacity. If you need more storage, you can easily get it with a command line command or something you do in the portal. You can run a script, and you can allocate more or less when your business needs it. And this scalability can be done by how busy is the CPU? Do I need to automatically provision a new server because our website's really getting hammered right now? Memory. If my memory is getting 80% utilized, time to spin up another server to handle the volume. If the network's being congested, you can have custom metrics. How many orders are coming in? I need to spin up a server. You can schedule it on Mondays through Fridays. I need more servers than I need on the weekend. So that gives you a lot of flexibility that you wouldn't have on-prem. I was working for a company and we sold recreational vehicles, RVs, and we were going to be featured in a reality TV show. And I had just recently moved them to Amazon Web Services, AWS. And then the big concern from the board of directors was, how are we going to handle the load? How do we know how many people are going to hit our website and shop for RVs once the reality show happened? And the answer from me and the staff was, it doesn't matter because we're in the cloud. And we peaked about 10x to 12x regular peak volumes, but we are able to handle that load because we're in the cloud. If we had been on-prem, it would have been a panic situation. We would have had to panic buy some extra hardware and hope that we bought enough. So it's really that scalability. If your company is in a business downturn, you have less business, so you need less servers, well, then you just reduce your spend in the cloud that day, that week, that month. So it really more tightly aligns how much resources you're using within IT and matching that to what your business is seeing. I think agility has always been a great advantage of the cloud based on my experiences. Hardware orders are often delayed. You might find certain memory is hard to find, so you're not going to get the hardware shipped as early as you'd like. Maybe some chipsets are on back order, monitors are on back order, other server hardware. So it really eliminates that hardware delay, and about 99.99% of the time in any major cloud provider, if you need a new server, you're going to get it. You may not get it in the same exact configuration, depending on how busy that certain data center for that cloud provider is, but that rarely happens. So you get the hardware when you need it and don't have to worry about any kind of order delays. As I said, provisioned and removed in seconds, and it doesn't get much faster than that. So what does that do? That speeds up development and the iteration. Hey, let's try this. Let's try this on a different size computer. That's very easy to do in the cloud. Typically on-prem, you want to try something with a different type of chipset in the server. You want to try it with more storage. You want to try it with more memory. Well, you typically have to buy that if you don't have that server sitting around waiting to be used. So you got much faster, much more efficient iterative changes to your environment. And what does that mean? That is a faster time to market. I've always worked on projects where, hey, we're upgrading our ERP to a new vendor. How much hardware do we need? And you worry about sizing that because you're going to make capital investment. You can't afford to get that wrong. In the cloud, you can afford to get that wrong because you only pay for what you use. So agility, speed to market, a great advantage of the cloud. You see a lot of companies, even if they're not fully committing to the cloud from a processing perspective, meaning, hey, they're not quite ready for any, possible reasons. It could be security, could be cost, could be they don't trust the cloud. But data backup is the way I see a lot of customers leveraging the cloud. Servers still on-prem, still running that private cloud. Maybe it's a co-location facility, but they're concerned about ransomware. So they want offsite backups. They want that to be offsite and in the cloud. They want the cloud provider to use immutable backups. And even if you don't create an AWS account or Azure account, companies like Veeam will do the backups and they will use the cloud providers on the back end for you. So you want to make sure your backups are immutable so they can't be encrypted like the rest of your servers typically can. And the encryption is across the wire. The encryption's once your data gets there. So a lot of companies, especially after the most recent issues that I've seen. Anytime there's new ransomware attacks, I think CrowdStrike also had an issue. People are like, boy, I need better backups. I need immutable backups. I need more snapshots taken every hour instead of just daily because I can't trust software providers to protect me from bugs. So I see companies using the cloud for big data backup. Companies are also using it for archival. To use AWS as an example, you've got Glacier Deep Archive, the cheapest storage AWS has. Companies may have compliance reasons to store data for 7 years. And so you can get very cheap storage on the cloud, much cheaper than you can find on-prem. Great thing about backing up to the cloud, data ingress is always free. It's free because the cloud providers know that when you send data up there, you're typically going to store it. Now, if you want to retrieve that data, they're going to charge you for data egress. But if you're backing up large volumes of data, you typically don't need to recover everything. So it's great that the data ingress is free. That's one less cost you have to worry about. It's easy administration. Everything can be done via command line or through the cloud provider's portal. And they've cloud native solutions are available for data backup. So if you're already in the cloud, it's easy to say, hey, I want to use your backup capability and I want to do this once an hour, once a day, once a week. And so even once you're in the cloud, we see companies not backing up to using third-party software. They're using cloud native backup if they happen to already be in the public cloud. Disaster recovery, I field a lot of calls every week on companies wanting to improve their disaster recovery. And again, sometimes that's related to flooding in their area. Maybe it's, I live in Florida. We see a lot of companies every time there's a hurricane want to talk about disaster recovery. Sometimes they have an existing disaster recovery. They're using Azerto, 1111, other third party, and they're like, does the cloud offer less expensive disaster recovery solutions? And typically it is, because I've done the pricing myself. The great thing about using the cloud for disaster recovery, you don't have to sign any long-term contracts like you do with other third parties. AWS has really an RTO measured in minutes, the RPO also in minutes. So both are typically less than an hour. A lot of your RTOs are based on the amount of bandwidth you have to AWS and whether you're using a small limited bandwidth to the internet and then thus to your cloud provider, you can expect it's going to take a while for the data replication to take place. But assuming you have sufficient bandwidth, that RPO and RTO typically measured in minutes and less than an hour. If you use the cloud for disaster recovery, it uses what's called a pilot light. And a pilot light DR scenario means you don't have full-size servers waiting there for a disaster to happen. If you're going to do this on-prem or with a co-location facility, if you have big, beefy servers handling production to service your business, the decision has to be made when you buy all that hardware. Do I want like for like, apples to apples? Do I pay all the same money for the same power and all my servers and storage? If so, then you just doubled the cost of providing services to your business. Some companies say, well, in the disaster, people aren't going to complain as much about performance. They're just lucky they have a system to recover too. So maybe it's 80% volume. Well, if you use the cloud for DR, what you're paying for until you declare a disaster are very low-end servers. Those servers are there just to help with replicating data. You don't pay for slightly beefy servers or full-size servers. You get to pick. You don't pay for those until you declare a strategy. So you don't have the 2x or the 1.5x cost. You're paying for low, inexpensive servers. You're paying for storage, which is much cheaper than compute. And you've got that pilot light because that light's burning, but it's waiting for you to declare a disaster before it really goes full throttle. Recovery is very fast in the cloud, and you've got the ease of scalability. You can scale that more. If you went with 80% because you wanted to minimize costs, you declared a disaster. Some applications, that's not good enough. It's impacting customer experience. Then you can go ahead and within a few seconds change that server size. So a lot of companies using DR for the cloud, even if they're not in the cloud today. Innovation is one of, I think, the advantages that means a lot more today than maybe it did 5 or 8 years ago. But typically, if you're running on-prem and you want to try some innovative technologies such as AI or generative AI, also known as Gen AI, you had to order new hardware for that. You had to decide what software, whether it's open source or third party, and accessing innovative software and solutions took a lot more time and effort, and typically budgeting wasn't as simple. But if you're in the cloud, it doesn't matter what top tier cloud provider you're using, AI is there, data analytics is there. So you've got easy access to innovative technologies, and whether you use them or not is up to you. So keep in mind that if you're in the cloud, yes, you can do traditional computing. You can write your PHP, your Python, your Java, your .NET applications, and you can write applications the same way you've been doing it the last 5, 10 years. But the cloud providers also give you access to a lot of additional innovative tools. It's in their best interest to do so because that's how they remain competitive with the other cloud providers. As I said, you're not dealing with third-party contracts. You're not committing to any long-term use. If that POC, you test out Gen AI, it sounded like a great use case, but the business really didn't see any value in it today, then it's easy to tear down those resources. Maybe you paid for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but you said, okay, that's not ready for prime time, at least for our business. So you tear that down, you're no longer paying for it. So a lot of companies are taking advantage of the fact that they can become much more innovative for their companies, how they're delivering IT services, because the cloud providers make that easily accessible to them. Resilience. I've worked for a large number of companies, and it's hard to get budget to make sure that everything is 99.999% available. And so you have to cut corners sometimes, and sometimes is you just hope things don't break. But if you're going to use one of the top cloud providers, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, or IBM, they've got the power redundancy you need in a top tier data center, probably more redundant than a lot of companies would want to pay for themselves. They've got the backup generators. They've got redundant internet connections. They've got multiple links into the data center, so you don't have a single conduit running into a company location, data center location like some smaller companies have. Cooling is redundant, so if you lose your primary HVAC, it'll have backup cooling available. I should have mentioned, I did mention generators, so you don't have to worry about that. One of the weaknesses I've seen in a lot of the companies where I've managed the IT departments is how much does the company want to spend on a backup generator? And sometimes it's just rack-based units, and you might get 15 minutes, you might get 30 or an hour of running, and they hope that the utility company gets the power back on. In the case of a hurricane, you can be out for weeks. And so not every company wants to pay for a diesel generator and maintain that and keep that up. So you get those advantages in the cloud providers. When you use cloud native services, those are resilient by design. If you use a server, if that server's hardware fails, the motherboard fails, storage, a memory chip, I have yet, and I've been using the cloud for about 8 years, I've yet to experience a failure in a server that wasn't related to the operating system and is related to hardware, because that switch happens so fast, you're really abstracted from any of the server hardware failures. Storage is highly redundant. If you use a network load balancer, if you use a firewall, a web application firewall, those are resilient and redundant by design. To you, it looks like a single load balancer or a single firewall. But behind the scenes, those are multiple network firewalls, multiple WAFs, web application firewalls. And if one fails, service fails over to the other without all the complexity of having to do that. If you've ever set up, say, Palo Alto firewalls on-prem, had to design that to be highly available and redundant, there's a lot of configuration that goes in. The cloud providers are going to do that for you. And the services themselves are highly redundant. So storage is going to be there, compute's going to be there, the load balancer, the data lake for data analytics, those services are also highly available. Does that mean that the cloud is guaranteed to not go down? Absolutely not. You can Google, you've seen GCP, Azure, AWS outages, sometimes or more often related to human error than hardware design, but they're not perfect. But based on my experience and everything that I've seen and heard, typically it's going to be more redundant than it is that then the company will provide in their own data center, because that's how these business entities make money. AWS, Google, Microsoft wouldn't make money if they weren't highly resilient and highly redundant. So that's an advantage. Sometimes that doesn't show up in the total cost of ownership. Companies are cutting corners. And so when you analyze the cost of the cloud, you're getting a higher level of service, a higher tier data center that you had taken the risk for. You're not running that in your own data center, but now you're benefiting from it. So at the end of the day, you're protecting your customers, protecting your business better, but sometimes that will show up in the cost. So now let's talk about cloud adoption metrics, just to show that, and I talk to customers every single day of the week. A lot of companies are already in the cloud. And if you look at a lot of these surveys, you think, boy, is there anyone left that's not in the cloud? And I would say, based on my experience, there's still a lot of companies. And think about it, if you just bought hardware, and that hardware has 5 more years of useful life, are you in a hurry to move to the cloud? No, because you've already bought that hardware. If you could sell it, but you're going to sell it typically at maybe 20% of what you paid for it. So they're going to wait for that hardware to reach end of life. But what I see companies doing, when that hardware does reach end of life, they start doing the analysis and say, boy, maybe instead of buying more hardware to refresh my servers, maybe I may move to the cloud. So not uncommon to have companies today that are thinking about the cloud, but not in there. But I pulled these metrics from a variety of sources, as you can see on the screen. It's a $561 billion business, and so it's only going to get bigger, especially with Gen AI, other innovation. More and more companies are going to decide they don't want to buy their own hardware anymore. So that $500 billion is just going to get bigger. Predictions are by the end of this year, spending will continue to increase by 20%. Again, that's company growth, that's using innovative technologies in the cloud or new cloud adopters. This was interesting to me. It is estimated that 60% of all corporate data is now stored in the cloud. A lot of companies still aren't comfortable with that. I talk to those companies every day. Is it really as secure as what I can do on-prem? And my answer is, the cloud security as good as you want to make it. It's virtually assured that the top cloud providers are running a more secure physical environment. With biometrics, they probably have more cameras than you. They probably do more extensive background checks than you, because that is in their business. They are in the business of providing cloud services, all run out of data centers. But you have to be comfortable with putting your data in the cloud, and you can make it as secure or more secure than you do on-prem. Every time I moved a company to the cloud, I felt that our overall security posture was better in the cloud than it had been on-prem because you have much more tools there. 90% of all large enterprises are multi-cloud. So that means they're not just using Amazon's AWS, not just using Microsoft's Azure, but typically AWS and Azure, or maybe AWS and GCP from Google. So the large enterprises are running multiple clouds, but I would say in the mid-market or the small to mid-sized businesses, the SMB market, typically you'd see one cloud, sometimes two, but the smaller companies typically just in one cloud. They don't want to staff up to run cloud engineers that know both. It's sometimes hard enough to afford someone who knows just AWS or knows just Azure. Getting someone to know both very well is even more expensive. In terms of cloud adoption, I would say security is the biggest challenge. And that's really because on-prem in a data center and a co-location facility, you've had years of experience tightening the security there. You've got typically one centralized firewall. Someone's managing that. You've got dedicated security engineers, resources managing that for you. A lot of companies, when they move to the cloud, they ask their DevOps engineers or their cloud engineers or the cloud developers to manage security. And those cloud security services are different oftentimes than what you've used on-prem. So there's a learning curve. And so companies sometimes use third parties to help them get over that hump, get a nice secure landing zone built, make sure you've got all the security tooling in place before you migrate any servers. So to me, what is the biggest challenge? It's learning curve, and security is top of mind because once you get compromised, you're not only at financial risk, but you've got a lot of disenchanted customers and a lot of potential litigation in terms of lawsuits. I mentioned I felt like security was better once I moved these companies to the cloud, and that's bears out in the metrics. 94% of companies surveyed believe that once they went to the cloud, they got to do it from fresh. I've managed a lot of legacy firewalls. You ask the security engineers, why are these rules in? Oh, we don't know why the firewall has those rules, but we're afraid to take them out because we could break something. So one of the advantages of moving to the cloud is you get to design security from the ground up. You've got no legacy preconceived notions. You can figure out what ports and protocols need to be accessed. And so you're starting with a clean slate, which is why I believe security is almost always better in the cloud than it is on-prem because it's a fresh perspective. So now let's take a look at the cloud predictions. Where is cloud computing headed in the future? Well, one, and I see this time and time again, generative AI, also called Gen AI, and application modernization is going to fuel future cloud growth. Companies are finding out ways to better differentiate their businesses. I see companies investing in data lakes, data analytics. Companies are trying to figure out how Gen AI may help them. I think just a commentary on Gen AI, there's a lot of companies looking for valid use cases, valid business cases. They're still kicking the tires. Unless you're a Fortune 500 company, there's typically not any killer Gen AI apps today. But I do see a lot of companies saying, hey, we have a lot of documentation and PDFs. How can we build a chatbot? So if someone has HR related questions, for instance, or if they need answers in different languages, can Gen AI be used for that? And the answer is yes. So I don't see Gen AI being baked into existing applications today as much as I've got all this historical documentation and documents and PDFs and Word documents. How can I use Gen AI and how can I use human conversation whether it's voice, whether it's a chatbot, and gain access to that in a more efficient manner instead of using search features. Gen AI is going to be baked into many. I have AWS because I work for an AWS partner, I should say, in many native cloud services. So you see all the security services that the cloud providers are building are going to have Gen AI capabilities to make security stronger. They're using Gen AI to make cost optimization strategies more common. And I think in the coming years, in 1 or 2 years, if you have a question about your cloud environment, you'll be able to chat that within the console and say, what are my biggest risks in terms of security of my cloud environment? So you have less reliance on a cloud engineer who really has to understand security, because Gen AI is going to allow you to interact with these cloud environments and get more English speak and less technical jargon, less knowledge of which portal web page do I go to find out my risks. A lot of that will be more English language or your native language. So that's going to be great. But that'll also drive people to the cloud. Quantum computing, I'm not a quantum computing expert, but think of this as compute technologies in terms of chipsets that can solve problems that today's modern chipsets cannot solve. And if you read about quantum computing, yes, the hackers will have access to that. There's risks that as quantum computing becomes commonplace, that will help hackers defeat today's encryption algorithms. But I'm sure, services will be built to try to protect against that. Quantum computing will provide other encryption algorithms that are harder to solve. I don't really see, or most people don't see, a whole lot of movement in quantum computing in the 2020s, but they do believe that'll become available as a service by cloud providers for practical applications. There's some today available, but for practical applications in the 2030s. There's a big move to edge computing. Edge computing means not computing in Virginia or California or wherever your cloud provider is, but edge computing that is closer to your customer, closer to your business. So latency is much better. So you get a better customer experience. That dependency on low latency means, yes, I can start using the cloud for other services that require much lower latency than I can get. It also means you don't necessarily have to have a direct connect or a fiber connection to the cloud to get low latency, as that edge computing is pushed into more local locations for your business to take advantage of. Service meshes will evolve if you use AWS like I do. You see VPC Lattice is a service that really just has an inventory of all your services. So instead of working on networking and say, this IP address range needs to talk to this IP address range only on these ports and protocols, VPC Lattice, which is a service mesh, which is still version 1.0, hasn't taken off yet, but really says, I want this application A, to talk to application B. Those applications know what ports and protocols are required, and that routing will be taken care of automatically, so you don't have to be a network engineer to make sure all of your applications talk together. The security teams will say, boy, that black box networking, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that because we don't know how services are talking to each other. But for the IT leaders, the service mesh is nice because it abstracts a lot of the lower level networking and lets you just think about business applications. So nothing really practical from the cloud providers, but you start to see them, they're announcing services, and they're not quite ready for prime time, but I do see Fortune 500 companies testing that out, getting used to those when they become a more commonplace. Lastly, low code and no code development is going to continue to mature. A lot of people write code by going into ChatGPT, other cloud environments to say, hey, I need to write an application that does ABC. Sometimes, they talk about prompt engineering is important because the better your prompt engineering, with Gen AI, the better quality of application. But we'll continue to see that honed and improved in the future to take some of the heavy burden off of the developer so they can work on what parts of the application need to serve the business and not have to worry about developing the most efficient sync sort or sort of application data. I wanted to follow up with a quote. Ironically, this is from the CEO of VMware, at least who had been the CEO of VMware. VMware is bought by Broadcom. And if you're in the industry and are paying attention, Broadcom is increasing the cost of their virtualization software, driving a lot of people to non-VMware cloud options. But cloud is about how you do computing, not where you do computing. And the only change I would make to this quote is cloud should be. I see a lot of companies, they move to the cloud, they keep large monolithic applications, one application server talking to one database server. Everything's a relational database. And the cloud is about, okay, how do I take advantage of this vast cloud variety of services and how do I make my services the most efficient possible? So you can lift and shift and move to the cloud, but at some point, stop thinking about those old paradigms and start thinking about, hey, the cloud offers so much more. AWS, Azure, GCP should be seen as much more than just a data center. Let's take advantage of innovative services. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, I want you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and we'll leave a couple minutes for questions if you have any. And while we wait for those, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just a little bit about me. I do work for a cloud provider who specializes in AWS, but if you want to link to me, if you ever have any questions, I love chatting about cloud. I'm old enough to know what it's like to run on-prem data centers. I do understand the advantages of the cloud. So you can reach me through LinkedIn. You can reach out to the Cloud Institute. They have many more people qualified to talk about the cloud and to do training on the cloud, a vast number of resources available at the Cloud Institute. So I want to thank you for this. Hopefully I'll be back for more, but I've done 3 different webinars in addition to this one on how companies are using generative AI, and also why security in the cloud is so challenging. But in addition to those 3, a lot of other content available on the Cloud Institute. You can reach us on the web at cloudinstitute.io. You see the email addresses there. So please reach out. We appreciate your time and attention today and hope everyone has a great day. Thanks, and we'll see you again.